Seconds before being taken away, the maid shows a letter and saves the millionaire judge. Jessica Lynn Parker walked toward the mansion's door with her hands in handcuffs, escorted by 2 court officers. Her brown eyes were red from crying so much, but her expression showed a determination that surprised everyone present in the elegant entry hall. It was exactly at that moment that she turned to Judge Richard Harrison, the respected 62-year-old judge, who was watching the entire scene with a broken heart. With a sudden movement, Jessica raised the yellowed envelope she had been discreetly holding and shouted with all the strength she had left, "Judge Harrison, I have proof that you're being framed." Her voice echoed through the marble corridors of the residence. The judge, who until that moment had remained completely silent, felt his blood run cold. For weeks he had been under investigation for alleged misappropriation of public funds intended for the renovation of the city's courthouse. The accusations were so serious that his 3-decade career was hanging by a thread. "Stop," ordered Richard, with the authority he still possessed. "Release her immediately." The officers hesitated for a moment, looking at each other unsure of how to proceed. Jessica took advantage of that moment of confusion to approach the man she had served loyally for 15 long years. "Judge, I know who's doing this to you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "And I also know who put those diamond earrings in my closet." Richard felt his legs tremble. His wife Barbara's earrings had been found in Jessica's maid's room the previous morning. The discovery had been the trigger for Barbara to demand the immediate arrest of the employee. "Jessica, what are you talking about?" asked the judge, trying to maintain his composure in front of the officers who were watching attentively. "This letter, Judge Harrison." Jessica raised the envelope with her still handcuffed hands. "It was left to me by my mother. She worked at the courthouse for 20 years before she passed away, and she knew things I've kept all these years waiting for the right moment." The name of Jessica's mother echoed in Richard's memory like distant thunder. Margaret Parker had been an exemplary court employee until her early retirement exactly 12 years ago, a simple woman, but with unquestionable honesty. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Barbara Harrison, who until then had been watching the scene from the top of the mahogany staircase, quickly descended the steps. At 58 years old, she maintained the elegance and proud bearing that had characterized her since youth. Her carefully styled blonde hair swayed with each hurried step. "Richard, don't listen to this woman," said Barbara, with a coldness that made Jessica shudder. "She's desperate and will make up anything to get out of this." But something in Jessica's expression made Richard hesitate. In 15 years working in his home, the maid had never shown any sign of dishonesty. On the contrary, she had been a constant and reliable presence, especially during the family's most difficult moments. "Let her speak," decided the judge, gesturing for the officers to wait. Jessica took a deep breath, knowing this was the most important moment of her life. Everything she had kept silent about all those years could finally come to light. "Judge, my mother discovered a scheme at the courthouse when I was still a teenager," began Jessica, her voice gaining strength. She saw documents being altered, signatures being forged, but when she tried to report it, she was threatened and forced to retire. Richard felt a chill in his stomach. Margaret had indeed retired unexpectedly, claiming health problems that never seemed convincing. "Before leaving this world, she made me promise that I would keep this evidence," Jessica continued, shaking the envelope, "and that I would only show it if an honest man were ever wrongly accused." Barbara stepped forward, her face pale as paper. "This is ridiculous, Richard. Are you going to believe the fantasies of a thief?" "I am not a thief," Jessica exploded, tears streaming down her face. "I have worked in this house since I was 20 years old. I cleaned, I cooked, I took care of your children when they were little. How can you accuse me of such a thing?" The mention of the children struck Richard deeply. Jessica had been practically a second mother to David and Jennifer during their childhood, when he and Barbara worked long hours. "What is in that letter, Jessica?" asked Richard, reaching out his hand. Jessica looked directly into her employer's eyes, those same kind eyes that had welcomed her when she was just a frightened young woman in need of work. It has proof of who is really embezzling money from the courthouse judge, and it also has proof of who planted the diamond earrings in my room." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the antique clock in the hall. Barbara had turned to stone, her eyes fixed on the yellowed envelope. Richard took the letter from Jessica's hands and, with trembling fingers, broke the seal that had remained intact all those years. The paper was old, but Margaret's handwriting was unmistakable. As his eyes scanned the first few lines, Richard felt the world crumbling around him. There were names, dates, amounts listed, and at the center of it all a revelation he could never have imagined. "Barbara," he said, his voice almost inaudible, "you need to see this." But when he looked up, his wife had vanished from the staircase. Jessica watched her employer's reaction and knew that finally the truth was coming out. For years she had carried that burden, knowing that her mother had died keeping secrets that could destroy innocent lives. "Judge Harrison," she said softly, "my mother told me that Mrs. Harrison is not who you think she is." The court officers, who had until then remained in respectful silence, began to show signs of impatience. One of them cleared his throat discreetly. "Judge Harrison, we need to resolve this situation. The arrest warrant." "The warrant is suspended," Richard declared firmly, without taking his eyes off the letter. "Jessica, tell me everything. From the beginning." Jessica felt the handcuffs being removed from her wrists. The feeling of freedom was so intense that she had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. "My mother worked in the courthouse archives," she began, massaging her sore wrists. "She had access to all the old documents. That's how she discovered that some case files were being altered after they had been adjudicated." Richard shook his head, still trying to process what he was reading. "She told me there was a person at the courthouse who had connections with important people in Chicago, someone who could change case outcomes after they had already been finalized." "And who was that person?" asked Richard, though he already suspected the answer. Jessica took a deep breath before answering. "Mr. Edward Thompson, the former chief clerk." The name hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. Edward had been his mentor when he was still a young magistrate. More than that, he was Barbara's father. "My mother discovered he was taking money to alter sentences, especially in cases involving asset division and business disputes," Jessica continued. "And Mrs. Harrison, she knew all about it." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in Richard's mind. Barbara had always shown a surprising knowledge about the cases he presided over, even when he didn't discuss anything at home. "There's more, Judge," said Jessica, pointing to the envelope. "My mother photographed documents and recorded conversations." With trembling hands, Richard pulled from the letter a small old recorder and some photographs yellowed with time. The images clearly showed documents being altered, with stamps being placed over already written text. "Why did your mother never report this?" he asked. "She tried, Judge, but when she went to the district attorney at the time, she was threatened. They said they would harm me if she spoke up. She chose to remain silent to protect me." Jessica wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "In her final years, when her illness was already advanced, she made me promise that I would take care of you if something happened. She said you were different, that you were honest." Richard felt a lump in his throat. Margaret had passed away from cancer at 54, fighting bravely until the end. He remembered visiting her in the hospital a few times, touched by the dedication Jessica showed in caring for her mother. The sound of hurried footsteps on the staircase interrupted the moment. Barbara had returned, but now she was accompanied by a person who made Jessica instinctively step back. "Daddy," said Barbara, her voice choked, "I need you to explain to Richard that this woman is lying." Edward Thompson, at 78, still maintained the imposing presence that had characterized him for decades at the courthouse. His completely white hair was perfectly combed, and his blue eyes held the same coldness Jessica remembered from childhood. "Judge Harrison," said Edward, with the measured voice everyone knew, "don't give credit to the fantasies of a desperate maid." But Richard was no longer the impressionable young magistrate from decades past. He firmly held the old recorder and looked directly into his father-in-law's eyes. "Edward, I need you to tell me the truth. Did Margaret Parker really discover irregularities at the courthouse? Dear listener, If you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The silence that followed was charged with tension. Jessica watched the expressions of the three people before her, knowing her life and the reputation of the man she respected depended on that moment. Edward looked at his daughter, then at his son-in-law, and finally at Jessica. In his eyes, she could see the same fear she had noticed in her mother during her final years. Margaret was a complicated woman, he said finally, always seeing conspiracies where there were none. Then why was she forced to retire? Asked Richard, his voice firmer. It was health problems, you know that. Jessica could no longer contain herself. Lies, she shouted. My mother was healthy. She only got sick years after being forced to leave the courthouse, and you know very well why. Edward took a step toward Jessica, with an expression that reminded her of the worst moments of her childhood. This woman has no right to speak to me like that, he said to Richard. Send her away immediately. But Richard remained firm. Jessica, what else do you know? The employer's question gave Jessica the courage she needed to continue. I know that Mrs. Harrison planted the diamond earrings in my room last night, she said, looking directly at her employer. I saw when she entered my room at 2 a.m. Barbara visibly paled. That's absurd. Why would I do such a thing? Because you discovered that Judge Harrison was being investigated and needed a scapegoat, Jessica replied firmly. Did you know that if I were arrested for theft, no one would believe the evidence I had against your father? The accusation echoed through the hall like a bomb. Richard looked at his wife with an expression mixing disbelief and deep pain. Barbara, is this true? Of course not, she protested, but her voice betrayed nervousness. Richard, would you believe this woman over me? I want to hear the recording, said Richard, turning on the old device. The voice of Margaret Parker, even distorted by time and the poor quality of the equipment, filled the silence of the hall. Edward, I can no longer pretend I don't see what's happening. Documents are being altered. Sentences are being changed. This isn't right, Edward's voice responded, younger but unmistakable. Margaret, you don't understand how things work. There are greater interests at play. Important people depend on these adjustments. But this is a crime, Edward. There's justice involved. Families are being harmed. And there are families being benefited too, including mine. Barbara is engaged to a promising judge. Do you think her life will be easy on a magistrate's salary? Jessica watched Richard's face transform as he listened to the recording. The pain in his eyes was almost unbearable to witness. The recording continued. Margaret, you have a young daughter to raise. Think carefully before doing something foolish. Accidents happen to people who don't know how to keep secrets. Are you threatening me? I'm protecting you. Retire now, with a full pension, and no one needs to know anything. Your daughter will grow up safe, and you'll have peace. The recorder emitted a noise, and the recording ended. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard looked at Edward with an expression he had never shown before. You threatened Margaret, he said, his voice filled with contained anger, and you involved my wife in this. Edward tried to maintain his composure, but his hands trembled visibly. Richard, you're being manipulated. This recording could have been edited, fabricated. Daddy, stop, interrupted Barbara, with tears in her eyes. There's no use lying anymore. The admission from his own daughter was like a final blow to Edward. He leaned against the wall, suddenly looking much older than his 78 years. Jessica watched the scene with mixed feelings. On one hand, she felt relief at finally seeing the truth revealed. On the other, it hurt to see the suffering on the face of the man she had served loyally for so many years. Barbara, said Richard, his voice broken, why did you put the earrings in Jessica's room? Barbara broke down crying, covering her face with her hands. Because I found out you were being investigated, she sobbed. And I knew that if the truth about Daddy came out, our family would be destroyed. I thought if Jessica were arrested, she couldn't present the evidence. But you knew she was innocent, said Richard, incredulous. I knew, admitted Barbara, and that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Jessica felt a mixture of anger and pity for her employer. For 15 years, She had believed she was part of that family. Discovering that Barbara was willing to sacrifice her to protect secrets from the past was a devastating blow. "Judge Harrison," said Jessica, her voice firm despite the tears. "There's one more thing you need to know." Richard looked at her attentively, preparing for another revelation. "The investigations against you aren't legitimate. They were fabricated using the same method my father-in-law used in the past." "How do you know this?" Jessica took an old cell phone from her pocket. "Because I recorded Mr. Thompson's conversation with someone on the phone last week. He thought I had gone shopping, but I was in the pantry and heard everything." With trembling hands, she played back the recording. Edward Thompson's voice was clear and unmistakable. "The situation is under control. The documents were planted in his office. The auditor we hired will find exactly what he needs to incriminate Richard." An unknown voice responded. "And are you sure he won't find out?" "I am. My daughter will have the maid arrested for theft before she can present any evidence. Without the evidence from the past, there's no way to connect the dots." "And after?" "After, Richard will be removed from the bench, and I will appoint someone we trust to take over the court. Someone who understands how things really work." The recording ended, and a deadly silence filled the room. Richard looked at Edward with a mixture of disgust and disappointment. "You destroyed my career to cover up your own crimes," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I did what was necessary to protect my family," Edward replied, trying to regain some of his former authority. "Protect?" Jessica interrupted indignantly. "You destroyed my mother's life, tried to destroy mine, and on top of that, you wanted to ruin the career of the most honest man I've ever known." The court officers, who had been listening to the entire conversation in respectful silence, began to shift restlessly. It was evident that the situation had grown much larger than a simple theft accusation. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Richard made a decision that would change the course of all events. "Jessica, do you have copies of these recordings?" "I do, Judge. My mother taught me to always keep evidence in safe places. The copies are at the bank in a safe deposit box I rented years ago." "And the original documents she photographed?" "They're there too." Richard turned to the court officers. "Gentlemen, please contact the district attorney's office immediately. We have evidence here of a corruption scheme that spans decades." Edward tried to head for the door, but one of the officers blocked his path. "Mr. Thompson, you'll need to remain available to the authorities." Barbara approached her husband with eyes red from crying. "Richard, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said, her voice choked. "But I want you to know that I never wanted it to come to this." "When you placed the earrings in Jessica's room, you made a choice," Richard replied, unable to look directly at her. "You chose to protect a criminal instead of protecting an innocent person." Jessica watched the conversation between the couple with a heavy heart. Even after everything that had happened, it still hurt to see the family falling apart like that. "Judge Harrison," she said softly, "I'm so sorry for all of this." Richard looked at her with genuine gratitude. "Jessica, you saved my reputation and my career. More than that, you brought to light a truth that needed to be revealed." "My mother used to say that the truth always finds a way to come out," she replied with a sad smile. "It just took longer than she expected." In the days that followed, news of the corruption scheme shook the entire county. The investigations revealed that Edward had altered hundreds of cases throughout his career, always benefiting people with important political or business connections. Jessica was not only cleared of all charges, but also publicly recognized as a civic hero. The mayor of Chicago even suggested naming a street in honor of her mother, Margaret Parker. Richard managed to prove his innocence and returned to his duties with even more prestige than before. He implemented new security protocols at the courthouse to prevent similar schemes from happening again. Barbara, devastated by guilt and shame, decided to temporarily leave Chicago. She separated from Richard but promised to fully cooperate with the investigations into her father's activities. Edward, at 78 years old, was indicted for forming a criminal organization document forgery, and making threats. Due to his advanced age, he would serve his sentence under house arrest, but his reputation was irreparably destroyed. Jessica continued working for Richard, but now in a completely different position. He promoted her to house administrator and substantially increased her salary, recognizing not only her loyalty, but also her courage. During quiet evenings, while organizing papers in Richard's office, Jessica often thought about her mother. Margaret had carried that heavy burden for so many years, always protecting her daughter, even while knowing the truth needed to come out someday. The relationship between Jessica and Richard also transformed. They developed a friendship based on mutual respect and genuine trust. He often consulted her about household decisions, and she felt truly valued for the first time in her professional life. David and Jennifer, Richard's children, were shocked to discover their mother's involvement in the scheme. They grew even closer to Jessica, recognizing the fundamental role she had played in their lives since childhood. Jennifer, who was now a lawyer, decided to specialize in domestic workers' rights, inspired by the courage and dignity Jessica had demonstrated. David, a successful businessman, offered financial help so Jessica could study and further qualify herself. The emotional scars from the episode took time to heal. Jessica went through periods of anxiety and insomnia, constantly reliving the moments of tension. Richard, noticing her difficulty, insisted she get psychological counseling, fully paid for by him. Therapy helped Jessica process not only the recent events, but also the trauma of growing up knowing her mother lived in fear. She learned to value her own courage and understand that she had honored Margaret's memory in the best way possible. The case gained national attention when journalists discovered the scheme had affected dozens of important cases over the decades. Families who had lost court disputes began questioning the outcomes, generating a wave of case reviews. Jessica was called to testify in several instances, always maintaining the serenity and precision that impressed prosecutors and judges. Her clear and emotional speech about her mother's dedication to the truth deeply touched everyone present. During one of these hearings, she met Samantha Williams, daughter of another former courthouse employee who had also been silenced decades earlier. The two women became close friends, united by their shared experience and desire to honor their mothers. Samantha revealed that her mother had left similar documents but never had the courage to reveal them. Inspired by Jessica's example, she decided to turn them over to the authorities, further strengthening the case against Edward and his accomplices. The corruption network turned out to be even more extensive than initially imagined. Other former courthouse employees began coming forward with accounts of pressure and threats. What began as a simple accusation of domestic theft had turned into one of the largest judicial scandals in the region's history. Richard became a respected figure in the fight against corruption. He implemented a whistleblower protection program at the courthouse and created secure channels for employees to report irregularities without fear of retaliation. Jessica was invited to speak at universities about ethics and civil courage. Her presentations, always moving and authentic, inspired hundreds of young law students to commit to professional integrity. As months passed, Jessica decided to resume the studies she had abandoned in her youth to care for her sick mother. Richard not only supported her decision, but also adjusted his work schedule so she could attend evening classes. She chose to study social work, inspired by her experience fighting for justice and her desire to help other people in vulnerable situations. Her teachers quickly recognized her unique maturity and life experience. During classes, Jessica often shared her experiences, always in a respectful and educational manner. Her classmates, initially curious about the famous maid, soon respected her for the depth of her reflections and the generosity of her character. The relationship between Richard and Barbara remained in a painful limbo. They only communicated through lawyers, discussing practical matters related to their separation and her cooperation with the investigations. Barbara had moved to her sister's house in another city, where she tried to rebuild her life away from the spotlight and public shame. She began working as a volunteer at an organization that helped low-income families in an attempt to find some meaning and redemption. In her occasional letters to Richard, Barbara expressed deep regret and took full responsibility for her actions. She never directly asked for forgiveness, recognizing that some wounds were too big to heal easily. Surprisingly, Jessica was the one who showed the most compassion for Barbara. In a conversation with Richard, she suggested that her former employer was suffering as much as anyone involved. "Judge Harrison," Jessica said in one of these conversations. Mrs. Harrison was also a victim of her father, in a way. She grew up in that environment of corruption, thinking it was normal. Jessica's generosity of spirit continued to surprise Richard. Even after all she had suffered, she could find compassion even for those who had tried to harm her. The hearings for the case stretched on for over a year. Jessica attended all of them, always accompanied by Richard, who made sure to support her at every step of the process. His presence strengthened her courage and reminded her that there were good people in the world. During one of these hearings, Jessica reunited with her mother's colleagues who came to testify. Many of them expressed regret for not having had the courage to support Margaret when she tried to report the irregularities. Mrs. Wilson, Margaret's old colleague, approached Jessica with tears in her eyes. "My dear, your mother was the bravest person I knew," she said, holding Jessica's hands. "We should have stood by her. Forgive our cowardice." Jessica hugged the elderly woman, understanding that fear had paralyzed many people over the years. She held no grudge against those who had remained silent for protection, but felt proud to have found the strength to speak when the right moment came. Edward's trial was an event that mobilized the entire city of Chicago. The former chief clerk, once respected and feared, now appeared fragile and diminished before the judges. His defense tried to claim age-related mental health issues, but the evidence was irrefutable. Jessica testified for 2 hours, detailing how her mother had discovered the scheme and how she had been threatened. Her speech was measured, clear, and deeply emotional, making a visible impact on everyone present. When the defense attorney tried to suggest that the recordings might have been fabricated, Jessica responded with a firmness that impressed even the most experienced judges. "Sir," she said, looking directly at the attorney, "my mother spent the last years of her life in fear. She would wake up startled, check the locks 3 times before going to sleep, and made me promise that I would never work at the courthouse. Why would she do that if she were lying?" The question echoed through the courtroom, and the attorney couldn't come up with a convincing response. The sentence was handed down on a rainy Thursday morning. Edward was sentenced to 8 years in prison, but due to his advanced age, he would serve his sentence under house arrest with electronic monitoring. Additionally, all his assets were seized to compensate the victims of the scheme. Jessica was present in the courtroom when the sentence was read. She felt a mix of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but it wouldn't bring her mother back or erase years of suffering. Richard held her hand during the reading of the sentence, a simple gesture that meant a lot to her. After so many months of struggle, they could finally move forward. As she left the courthouse, Jessica was approached by reporters who wanted her statement on the conviction. She paused for a moment, carefully considering her words. "Today the truth prevailed," she said, her voice steady. "My mother can finally rest in peace, knowing that her courage was not in vain. I hope other cases like this come to light so that no family has to go through what we did." Jessica's statements were widely shared, cementing her image as a symbol of courage and integrity. Invitations for speaking engagements and interviews poured in constantly, but she carefully chose those that could truly contribute to positive change. With the legal proceedings over, Jessica could finally focus entirely on her studies. She excelled in subjects related to rights advocacy and conflict mediation, areas where her personal experience added unique value to academic discussions. Richard watched Jessica's personal and professional growth with genuine pride. He had not only restored his reputation, but also gained a valuable and lasting friendship. Her presence in his life had become indispensable, not just as an employee, but as an advisor and confidant. The house, once marked by tension and secrets, now breathed tranquility. Richard adopted a simpler and more authentic routine, valuing genuine conversations and moments of peace. Jessica contributed to this atmosphere with her warm presence and wise perspective on life. David and Jennifer visited their father more often, enjoying the more relaxed atmosphere of the house. They developed a special relationship with Jessica, truly treating her as part of the family. Their conversations during dinners were enriching and full of genuine laughter. During school breaks, Jessica began hosting groups of college students at home, sharing her experience and mentoring young people interested in careers focused on social justice. Richard supported these initiatives, making his library available and offering his own reflections on professional ethics. One of the most memorable moments during this time was when Jessica received an invitation to be the keynote speaker for a graduating law school class. The honor, traditionally reserved for renowned legal scholars, recognized her unique contribution to justice and truth. In her graduation speech, Jessica spoke about the importance of listening to the voices of the most vulnerable and having the courage to confront corrupt systems, regardless of personal consequences. Her words were met with a prolonged and emotional standing ovation. Barbara, who watched the ceremony from afar, sent Jessica a letter congratulating her on the honor. The letter was respectful and full of genuine remorse, acknowledging the nobility of character Jessica had demonstrated from the beginning. Jessica decided to respond to the letter, extending an olive branch in a gesture of reconciliation that surprised even Richard. She wrote that she held on to resentments, but also recognized the flawed humanity in all of us and the capacity for change and growth. The exchange of correspondence between the two women gradually evolved into a dialogue about forgiveness, responsibility, and new beginnings. Barbara shared her experiences as a volunteer and her process of self-reflection, while Jessica offered perspectives on overcoming adversity and hope. Richard observed this evolution with growing admiration for Jessica. Her ability to find compassion even in the most difficult situations was a constant example of inner strength and emotional maturity. 2 years after the events that changed their lives, Jessica graduated from social work with academic honors. Richard made a point of being present at the ceremony, occupying the seat of honor traditionally reserved for close family members. During the graduation party at the mansion, Jessica reflected on the extraordinary journey she had taken since that terrible day when she was almost unjustly arrested. She thanked everyone present, but saved special words for Richard. "Judge Harrison," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "you not only believed in me when no one else would, but you also gave me the opportunity to grow and become the person I always dreamed of being. I will be eternally grateful." Richard replied that the gratitude was mutual, for Jessica had saved not only his career, but also his faith in humanity and the possibility of ordinary people making a difference in the world. With her diploma in hand, Jessica made a decision that had been maturing during months of reflection. She told Richard that she would like to open a support center for domestic workers and their families, offering legal guidance, psychological support, and professional training. Richard not only approved of the initiative, but also offered financial and logistical support to make the project a reality. He suggested that the center be named the Margaret Parker Institute, honoring Jessica's mother and her contribution to justice. The Institute's inauguration ceremony was an emotional event that brought together authorities, Margaret's former colleagues, students, and community members. Jessica cut the ribbon next to a photo of her mother, feeling that she had finally fulfilled her promise to honor her memory. In its first few months of operation, the Institute handled dozens of cases, offering everything from guidance on labor rights to mediation in domestic conflicts. Jessica worked tirelessly, applying both her personal experience and the academic knowledge she had acquired. One of the Institute's first clients was a young domestic worker who was being falsely accused of theft by her employers. Jessica immediately recognized the parallels with her own experience and gave special attention to the case. Through careful investigation and evidence gathering, Jessica managed to prove the young woman's innocence and expose the employer's attempt at a cover-up. The case gained local attention and strengthened the Institute's reputation as a defender of domestic workers' rights. Richard continued to actively support Jessica's work, often donating time and resources to the Institute's activities. He also became a reference for complex legal issues that arose during their services. Their professional partnership naturally evolved into a deep and mutually enriching friendship. They regularly dined together, discussing cases from the Institute, daily events and reflections on life and justice. During one of these conversations, Richard confessed that the episode with Edward and Barbara had been painful, but also transformative. He had learned to value authentic relationships and to distrust superficial appearances. Jessica shared that her experience had taught her about the importance of trusting one's instincts and having the courage to defend the truth, even when it seemed impossible or dangerous. They agreed that adversities, no matter how painful, often revealed inner strengths we never knew we had and opened paths to higher purposes. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave it in the comments with sincere words. Do you believe Jessica made the right decisions? We would love to read your opinion about courage and justice. Thank you so much for your company. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other exciting stories.